The traffic light on Riverside and Fifth felt like it would never change. Corinne Whitmore sat in her pearl-white Mercedes, both hands at 10 and 2, jaw clenched so tight her temples throbbed. The car smelled like leather and the vanilla air freshener she'd just replaced last week. The expensive kind from the boutique on Madison Avenue, not that garbage they sold at gas stations. Her Bluetooth had been connected for 45 minutes to the call with her husband, Richard, and she'd spent the last 30 minutes of those 45 listening to him tell her why she was wrong about everything. The decorator's choice for the summer home in the Hamptons. Her decision to fire the housekeeper without consulting him first. Never mind that the woman had been stealing jewelry. The way she'd spoken to his mother at the charity gala last month. "You embarrassed me, Corinne," he'd said, his voice that particular brand of cold that made her stomach twist. "You embarrassed us." She'd hung up on him. Now, sitting at this godforsaken red light in downtown, she was trying not to think about how his eyes had looked at breakfast that morning. Distant, already checked out, like he was calculating something in his head that didn't involve her in any meaningful way. The light remained red. A motorcycle pulled up next to her, stopping hard enough that she heard the tires grip the asphalt. She didn't look over immediately. She'd learned to ignore the roaring machines and their operators, the type of men who lived loud because they had nothing else. Her father had called them types with no breeding. Her mother had called them mistakes waiting to happen. But then the engine cut off, and in the sudden silence, she heard the kickstand deploy with a metallic clink. Corinne turned her head just slightly, eyes sliding toward the motorcycle. The man sitting on it was, without question, the most precisely wrong thing she'd ever seen. Tall, broad across the shoulders, all of him wrapped in worn leather that probably cost less than her handbag. His hair was dark, pulled back in a way that suggested he didn't particularly care what anyone thought about it. His arms were covered in tattoos, intricate ones, she noted with something like surprise, not the jailhouse trash she'd expected. A scar ran down his left cheek and disappeared into his beard. He was looking straight ahead at the red light, completely and utterly ignoring her. Something about that, the not looking, filled Corinne with a hot spike of anger she didn't fully understand. She'd spent the last 6 months feeling invisible in her own marriage, and here was this stranger, physically beside her, choosing not to even acknowledge her existence. The light remained red. "Excuse me," Corinne said, her voice slicing through the still morning air like a knife through silk. The biker turned slowly. His eyes were gray-green, the color of storm clouds, and when they landed on her, she saw a flash of something, amusement. No, something colder than that, understanding, like he could see through her whole elaborate architecture and had already decided he wasn't impressed. "Yeah," his voice was lower than she'd expected, not loud but carrying a weight that made her grip the steering wheel tighter. "You know there are noise ordinances in this city, right?" The words came out before she could stop them, each one dipped in contempt. "Some of us are trying to have a peaceful morning." The biker studied her for a long moment. She watched his jaw work slightly, like he was chewing on words he'd decided not to say. Then a smile spread across his face, not a friendly smile. A smile that suggested he'd just seen something that confirmed every cynical thought he'd ever had about people like her. "Noise ordinances," he repeated quietly, as if tasting the words. "Yes," Corinne said, emboldened by his silence. "It's not difficult to follow. You simply respect that other people don't need to hear your compensatory roaring all morning long." His smile widened. He shook his head slowly, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You woke up and chose violence this morning, huh?" he said. "I chose decency," she snapped, "which is clearly a concept foreign to you and your kind." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. She saw something shift in his eyes, a hardening, a calculation. She'd crossed a line she hadn't known was there. Part of her, the tiny rational part still connected to her prefrontal cortex, screamed at her to close her window, look away, let this go. But the rest of her, the part that felt small and powerless and invisible in her own life, was on a freight train now, and the tracks led only forward. "My kind," he repeated softly. "Yes," Corinne said. "The kind that thinks making noise and bothering decent people is somehow masculine or impressive. It's pathetic, actually." She watched his hands. They were large, calloused, with dark ink wrapping up his wrists. She watched them flex against the grips of his motorcycle, and for just a moment she wondered if she'd made a mistake, if she'd miscalculated something fundamental about the world and where she stood in it. Then he laughed, a real laugh starting low in his chest and rolling out into the street. "You know what?" he said, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But lady, you're looking at the world like it's supposed to follow your rules, like everybody is supposed to apologize for existing in a way you don't approve of." "That's not," Corinne started. "It is," he interrupted, and there was no humor in his voice anymore. "You probably think you're better than me. You in your fancy car with your—" He glanced at her hands on the steering wheel, at her diamond wedding band and the tennis bracelet Richard had given her for their anniversary. "Your nice things. You think that makes you superior, but the thing is, it just makes you fragile. You're so desperate to maintain your little perfect world that you're out here attacking strangers at red lights." Corinne felt heat flood her face. "I wasn't attacking you. I was making an observation about your inconsiderate." "You called me pathetic," he said flatly. "You judged me for existing in a way that's different from you, and then you got angry when I didn't bow and apologize." The light turned green. She didn't know why she didn't drive forward. It would have been the easy thing, the sensible thing, the right thing. She would have left him there at the corner, and by tomorrow she would have forgotten about it or filed it away as confirmation of everything she already believed about people like him. Instead, she said, "You're right, I apologize, I was rude, there's no excuse for that." She'd meant it. The words came out genuine, and she watched his expression soften slightly, confusion replacing the contempt. Then she added, because she apparently hated herself and wanted the world to know it, "But you're still loud, and you're still bothering people, and my life is infinitely more complicated than yours could possibly be." The car behind her honked. The light was green, but the biker didn't move. He leaned slightly toward her window, close enough that she could smell leather and gasoline and something underneath that, something like spent fire. "My life," he said slowly, carefully, like he was explaining something to a child, "is none of your fucking business. But I'm gonna tell you something anyway. You want to know what I see when I look at you?" Corinne's breath caught. She should drive. She knew she should drive. "What?" she whispered. "I see someone so unhappy that she has to make other people smaller just to feel tall. I see someone so trapped that she mistakes cruelty for strength." He paused, and something in his face shifted. "I see someone who's about to learn that the world doesn't give a shit about your problems, Corinne." Her blood went cold. "How did you—" "Your registration," he said, gesturing to the small frame visible on her dashboard, a custom frame from their club in Martha's Vineyard with their last name in gold lettering. "Whitmore, I know the name. Everyone in this city knows that name." The car honked again, more insistent now. "You're gonna remember this moment," he continued quietly. "You're gonna remember what you said, and you're gonna remember how it felt when you said it. And you're gonna know, really know, not just think it, that there are consequences for treating people like they don't matter." Then he turned back to face the road, grabbed his handlebars, and fired the motorcycle's engine to life with a roar that seemed to shake the entire street. The biker didn't wait for her to drive. He twisted the throttle, and the motorcycle shot forward, the front wheel lifting slightly off the ground as he accelerated. She watched him lean into the turn at the next intersection, saw the way other cars gave him space, and then he was gone, just the sound of his engine fatting into the distance. Corinne sat frozen at the green light. Behind her, someone was laying on their horn now, a long, aggressive blast of sound that seemed to pierce something in her chest. She pressed the accelerator, and the Mercedes glided forward into traffic. She'd gone to yoga. She'd had lunch with her friends at Canela, the restaurant where everyone who was anyone in their circle ate on Wednesdays. She'd attended a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital where she served on the board. She'd done everything she was supposed to do, worn all the right clothes, said all the right things, and underneath it all, that moment at the red light sat like a stone in her chest. "I see someone so unhappy that she has to make other people smaller just to feel tall." It was the kind of thing a stranger had no right to say. The kind of thing that should have been easy to dismiss. The angry words of someone beneath her, someone who didn't understand her life, her struggles, her carefully constructed world. Except she couldn't dismiss it. Every time she thought she'd let it go, it would bubble back up, a thought arriving unbidden. Was he right? Richard had been away on business when she got home that night. He texted her from the airport, a perfunctory message about flight delays with no kiss emoji at the end. When he'd returned 2 days later, they'd moved around each other in their penthouse apartment like planets in carefully balanced orbits, never quite colliding. She'd noticed he'd put his wedding band in the bathroom drawer next to his Rolex. She hadn't mentioned it. On Wednesday afternoon, between yoga and her lunch reservation, Karen sat in her therapist's office in a building on Central Park South. Dr. Melissa Chen had been her therapist for 4 years, ever since the postpartum depression after their daughter Sophie was born. Sophie was 11 now, and Karen hadn't had an official appointment in 3 years, though she'd called for an emergency session after a particularly brutal argument with Richard about his friendship with his new paralegal. This wasn't officially a session. This was Karen sitting in the waiting room, ostensibly reading a magazine about mindfulness, actually trying to decide if she had anything worth saying that wouldn't sound insane. Karen, the receptionist was looking at her oddly. Dr. Chen doesn't have you down for today. I know, Karen said quietly. Is she available just for a few minutes? The receptionist's expression softened, the same expression everyone got when they looked at Karen lately, she'd noticed. The expression of someone looking at a woman who was barely holding it together. Let me check, the receptionist said. 15 minutes later, Karen was sitting across from Dr. Chen in her carefully neutral office, the kind of space designed to put people at ease. Soft lighting, real plants, the sound of a tabletop fountain in the corner. Dr. Chen herself was small, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen every possible version of human suffering and never judged any of it. So you had an encounter at a traffic light, Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but precise. She always summarized back what you'd said to her, a technique that made you aware of how ridiculous your problems sounded when you heard them reflected. It sounds insane when you say it like that, Karen said. Does it? Dr. Chen tilted her head slightly. You had an interaction with a stranger that challenged some core beliefs you hold about yourself and other people. That seems like it could be significant. Karen looked down at her hands. He said I was unhappy. He said I make people smaller to feel tall. Is he right? The question hung in the air. Karen wanted to say no. She wanted to defend herself, to explain all the ways he was wrong, to prove that she was actually a good person, actually a kind person, actually everything she'd always believed about herself. Instead, she found herself crying, silent tears that rolled down her perfectly made-up face, destroying the work she'd done that morning with her MAC foundation and her $30 mascara. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know who I am anymore. Dr. Chen slid a box of tissues across the small table between them. Then maybe that's something worth exploring, not because this biker gave you permission to question yourself, but because you're clearly questioning it anyway. What would it mean if he was right, even partially? Karen spent the next hour doing something she hadn't done in years. She looked at herself honestly. She talked about Richard, about the way she'd been feeling invisible in their marriage, about how she filled the emptiness by accumulating things and status and the quiet admiration of people she didn't actually like. She talked about Sophie, and how she sometimes felt like she was raising a version of herself, carefully managed, perfectly presented, fundamentally afraid of being seen. She talked about her mother's voice in her head, the constant commentary about appropriate behavior and suitable people. She talked about the charity boards and the galas and the way she'd become a professional at seeming fine while slowly dissolving internally. When her time was up, Dr. Chen walked her to the door. I'd like to see you regularly again, she said. Not because of the biker, but because I think there's real work to do here and you're finally ready to do it. Karen nodded, unable to speak. She was walking toward her car when she saw it, a poster on a bulletin board outside a coffee shop on the corner. It was advertising an event at a community center in the neighborhood. The poster was vivid red and yellow, with pictures of people on motorcycles, and the headline read, Riders for a Reason Annual Charity Ride this Saturday. She stopped walking. It was ridiculous. It was a terrible idea. It was the kind of thing she absolutely should not do. Karen went into the coffee shop, took a picture of the poster with her phone, and researched the event for the next 2 hours, sitting in a corner booth with a matcha latte that cost $14 and tasted like grass clippings. The charity ride was organized by an organization called Riders for a Reason, a motorcycle club that raised money for local causes. This year's ride was benefiting a youth scholarship fund for kids from low-income neighborhoods. The ride would start at 9 a.m. on Saturday morning, departing from a warehouse in the East Village. Karen recognized some of the names immediately: local business owners, a city councilman, a federal judge. People she'd seen at galas and charity events, people who had somehow maintained that precarious balance between wealth and authenticity that Karen had always envied. And then, buried in a paragraph about the organizing committee, she saw a name that made her breath catch. Marcus Hayes, founder and president, writers for a reason. She Googled the name. Marcus Hayes was 43 years old, had a criminal record from his 20s, nothing violent. She noted with relief, mostly drug-related charges and some vandalism, and now ran a motorcycle repair shop called Hayes & Co. in Brooklyn. He'd been featured in an article in New York Magazine about reformed criminals who turned their lives around. The article mentioned that he'd spent 5 years in prison for drug distribution, that he'd come out in his early 30s with nothing, and that a chance encounter with a Harley-Davidson had changed everything. The photograph in the article was of Marcus on his motorcycle, his scarred face turned toward the camera, that same cold smile she remembered, except in this picture there was something else in his eyes. Something like strength earned through hard experience rather than inherited through wealth. Karen closed her laptop. She was not going to show up at a motorcycle charity ride like some obsessed woman. She was not going to try to find this man and continue a conversation that should have ended at a red light. She was not going to become one of those pathetic women she'd always judged, the kind who got fixated on men who were wrong for them. She was going to go home, have dinner with Sophie, maybe watch something mindless on television, and never think about Marcus Hayes again. She was still thinking about him on Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. when she found herself parking her Mercedes 3 blocks from the warehouse, sliding on a pair of sunglasses that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, and walking toward the sound of revving engines and male voices. The warehouse was chaos in the best possible way, motorcycles lined up in perfect rows, maybe 200 of them, riders in leather and denim and patches that indicated allegiances Karen didn't understand. She hung back at the edge of the crowd, completely out of place in her Gucci sunglasses and her Hermes scarf, watching. She found him almost immediately. He was standing near the front of the line, talking to a smaller man with a beard and a prosthetic left hand. Marcus was wearing a worn leather jacket with patches on the back, 2 wheels interlocking, an insignia that probably meant something to people in this world. He was laughing at something the other man had said, a real laugh that transformed his scarred face into something almost beautiful. He looked up, and his eyes found hers across the crowd like a homing missile finding its target. The world seemed to pause for just a moment. She saw recognition flash across his face, saw something like surprise, and then a calculation. He was trying to figure out what she was doing here. Karen turned and walked back toward her car. "Hey." She froze, his voice cut through the noise of the motorcycles like a blade. She didn't turn around. "Hey," he called again, and this time she heard footsteps behind her, his boots heavy on the pavement. She made it 5 steps before his hand caught her arm gently, not grabbing, just a touch on her elbow, the gentleness of it more shocking than any force would have been. "You came," he said. It wasn't a question. Karen turned around slowly. Up close, he was even more imposing than she remembered. "I was in the neighborhood," she lied. "You live on the Upper East Side," he said flatly. "In a penthouse in a building that probably costs more than my mother's entire block. You were not in the neighborhood." She didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with someone who saw you that clearly. "Why are you here?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, and meant it. "I read about the charity ride. It's for a good cause. I wanted to support it." "By showing up at 8:30 in the morning in Gucci sunglasses and an expression like you're about to be executed," he smiled slightly. "Come on, Karen." "I needed to apologize," she said suddenly. The words came out before she'd decided to say them. "For what I said, for how I treated you." He studied her for a long moment. "Okay," he said finally. "You've apologized, thank you. Why are you still here?" "Because you were right," she said quietly, "about most of it, and I wanted to know. I wanted to understand why you knew that, how you knew that." His expression shifted. Something vulnerable flickered across his face before he looked away. "Get out of here, Karen. Go back to your life. This isn't a place for you." "Why?" she asked. "Why isn't it?" "Because people like me and people like you don't mix," he said flatly. "Because you're going to go home and tell your husband or your friends about the rough biker you met, and you're going to feel like you've had an adventure. And I'm going to spend the next 6 months thinking about you, wanting something I can't have, and eventually hating myself for it. The honesty of it struck her like a physical blow. "You don't know that," she said. "Yeah, I do," he said. "It's always the same. Rich woman slumming, biker with a savior complex. It never ends well." "My marriage is falling apart," Karen said. He'd started to walk back toward the warehouse. She saw his shoulders stiffen. "I haven't slept in a bed with my husband in 6 months," she continued, the words spilling out like she'd opened a wound. "He sleeps in the guest room. He takes out his wedding band and puts it in a drawer like it's an uncomfortable article of clothing. He's having an affair with his paralegal. I saw text messages on his iPad that—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know how to be a wife or a mother or whatever it is I'm supposed to be. And the only person who made me feel something real, something honest, in probably 2 years was a man who yelled at me at a traffic light." He turned around slowly. His gray-green eyes were searching her face, looking for lies, for performance, for the usual social masks people wore. "My marriage is falling apart too," he said quietly. "My ex-wife took my daughter, she's 10. I get her every other weekend, and Chloe spends the whole time angry at me because I work on motorcycles and she wants a father with a normal job. My apartment is 500 square feet above the repair shop. I've been sober for 8 years, but I still go to meetings twice a week because the pull toward the old life never really goes away. So no, Karen. People like us mixing is not a good idea." "Why?" she asked. "Why does it have to be bad?" "Because," he said, and there was so much weariness in his voice that it broke something in her chest. "You're going to wake up tomorrow and remember who you are, and you're going to realize you made a mistake, and I'm going to have to watch you leave. Again." "You don't know that," Karen repeated. "I do," he said. "Trust me." But he didn't walk away. He stood there 3 feet away from her, and neither of them moved. The call for riders to mount up echoed across the parking lot. Marcus glanced back toward the warehouse. "Come on," he said finally. "Ride with me. If you still want this tomorrow, then we'll figure something out. But ride today, see what this is actually like." Karen's stomach twisted. "I don't have a helmet." "There are extra helmets at the warehouse." "I've never been on a motorcycle." "There's a first time for everything," he said, and for just a moment she saw something like humor in his eyes. "Besides, you've already pushed me at a red light and shown up at my charity event. How much worse could it be?" She should have said no. She should have gotten in her Mercedes and driven back to her penthouse and called Richard and suggested they go to marriage counseling or have a real conversation or do literally anything besides what she was about to do. Instead, she said, "Okay." 20 minutes later, she was wearing a helmet that smelled like someone else's hair, sitting behind Marcus on a motorcycle, her arms wrapped around his waist, her heart hammering against her ribs. He'd told her to hold on tight, to trust him, to keep her head down when they turned. The ride was incredible. She'd expected to be terrified, and she was, but underneath the fear was something else. A sense of freedom so complete that she almost couldn't breathe. The city rushed past her in a blur of color and motion. The wind tried to rip her away. The only things real and solid in the world were Marcus's body in front of her and the road beneath them. They rode for 2 hours, the motorcycle club moving through the city like a pack, 100 riders strong, drawing attention, causing a stir. Every time they stopped at a light, Karen was aware of people staring, aware of how wrong this picture was, her in her Hermes scarf and expensive boots, clinging to the back of a biker with a criminal record, surrounded by leather and ink and everything she'd been trained to fear. She'd never felt more alive. They stopped for lunch at a diner in the Bronx, a place that served huge plates of food and strong coffee, where the waitress called Marcus by name and asked how Chloe was doing, where nobody cared about Karen's vintage Rolex or her tailored dress. Marcus introduced her as a friend, and she wasn't sure if that was protection or shame. Over coffee, he told her about his daughter, about his ex-wife, about the moment he'd made the choice to get sober. He'd woken up in a hospital after an overdose and looked at a picture of his 6-year-old daughter on the wall, and something in him had broken open. He'd spent the next 8 years putting himself back together. Karen told him about her childhood, about her mother's endless criticism, about her father's emotional distance, about the way she'd learned early that love meant proving your worth through achievement and acquisition. She told him about Sophie, about how terrified she was that she was passing all of that damage on to her daughter. She told him about Richard, and how she'd realized at some point that she didn't love him anymore. She wasn't even sure she ever had. She'd married him because he was the right choice, the socially acceptable choice, the logical progression of her carefully planned life. "So leave him," Marcus said simply. Corinne had nearly choked on her coffee. "It's not that simple. There's Sophie, there's the prenup," she stopped herself. "There's my whole life." "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. "That's the problem. Your whole life is built on a lie. So either you keep living it or you blow it up and build something real instead." The ride back was different. As the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Marcus pulled off the main road and onto a smaller street, heading toward the water. They ended up at an overlook in Red Hook, a place where you could see the Statue of Liberty in the distance, where the city sprawled out below them like some glittering prize. He killed the engine, and they sat there in silence for a long time. "This was a mistake," Marcus said finally. "This whole thing, I shouldn't have let you get on the bike." Corinne's heart sank. "Why?" "Because now I'm going to want to do this again," he said. "And again. And I'm going to want things I shouldn't want. I'm going to want a woman who's going to go home to her penthouse and her failing marriage and eventually choose that over this. Over me." Corinne didn't have an answer to that, because part of her knew he was right. Part of her knew that she would eventually have to go home and face the consequences of her life. But there was another part, a part that had woken up on the back of his motorcycle and decided that some things mattered more than safety. "What if I don't?" she said quietly. "What if I choose this?" He turned around carefully on the bike, keeping it balanced, and looked at her. "Then you're braver than I thought, and also probably dumber." "Maybe both," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her, and it was the most reckless thing she'd ever done. They got back to the warehouse at 7 p.m. Corinne's phone had 47 missed calls and 23 text messages. Most of them were from Richard. The last one said, "Where the fuck are you? We're supposed to be at the Hendersons' dinner party in an hour. You're making me look like an idiot." She'd forgotten, completely and utterly forgotten about the dinner party. Marcus helped her off the motorcycle. "Go," he said quietly. "Go home, go to your dinner party, think about what you want, really think about it. And if you decide that you want something different that you want me, then call me, but only if you're sure." She didn't call him that night. She went to the dinner party in a state of shock, still smelling like leather and gasoline, still feeling the phantom pressure of his body in front of her. Richard had barely acknowledged her, and she'd spent the evening making small talk with people whose names she'd forget immediately. She'd smiled when appropriate, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and felt like an actor playing the role of Corinne Whitmore, wife and charity board member and woman of appropriate status. At midnight, she'd gone home and found Richard asleep in the guest room with his laptop still open. She'd closed it without looking at the screen. She'd laid in her own bed, the bed they'd bought together, the bed where they'd once made love with something resembling passion. And she'd thought about Marcus's scarred face and his impossible honesty. At 2 a.m., she'd gotten up and written him a text message, "I'm sure." Then she'd put the phone in a drawer and gone back to bed, not knowing if she'd send it, knowing only that her life had been irrevocably split into before and after. The text was sent before she could convince herself not to send it. Marcus responded immediately, "Call me." Corinne sat on her bathroom floor at 2:47 a.m., the phone pressed to her ear, listening to his voice on the other end of the line, rough with sleep but immediately alert when he realized it was her. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said. "What are you scared of?" "Everything," she admitted. "I'm scared of my daughter hatting me. I'm scared of what my mother will say. I'm scared of losing my money and my status and my place in the world. I'm scared of disappointing everyone who's counting on me." "Okay," Marcus said, and she could almost hear the nod in his voice. "Those are all legitimate fears. What are you scared of if you stay?" Corinne couldn't answer that immediately, because the fear of staying was more diffuse, more fundamental. It was the fear of disappearing entirely, of becoming a ghost in her own life, of reaching the end and realizing she'd never actually lived. "That too," she whispered. "Yeah," he said softly. "Welcome to being human." They stayed on the phone as the night gave way to morning. He told her about the first time he'd tried to change his life, after his first stint in prison. He'd tried to do what was expected. He'd gotten a job at a warehouse. He'd rented a small apartment. He'd tried to be normal. And he'd lasted exactly 3 months before the weight of trying to fit into a world he didn't belong to had crushed him back into old patterns. "It took me 2 more arrests to realize something," he said. That I couldn't build a real life by imitating one, that I had to build it from the pieces of who I actually am, not who I'm supposed to be. How did you know how to do that? Corinne asked. I didn't, he said. I just kept failing until I found something that stuck. By the time Sophie woke up, Corinne had made a decision. Not a plan. She was terrified of planning anything because plans could go wrong, but a decision. She was going to tell Richard the truth. Not because she wanted to punish him, not because she wanted revenge, but because she couldn't keep living in a lie and expect her daughter to learn how to live truthfully. Richard was in the kitchen when Corinne came downstairs. He was on his second espresso, scrolling through his phone, completely ignoring Sophie, who was eating cereal and watching YouTube videos on her iPad. We need to talk, Corinne said. Richard didn't look up. About what? About us, about our marriage, about the fact that it's over. That got his attention. He set down his phone, and she watched his face go through several emotions in sequence: surprise, anger, and then something that looked almost like relief. Are you having a breakdown? He asked carefully, as if she were a volatile device that might explode. No, Corinne said. I'm finally having a breakthrough. Sophie had gone quiet, her YouTube video paused, her eyes flicking between her parents. Can we not do this in front of Sophie? Richard said tersely. She's going to find out eventually, Corinne said. Might as well she hear it from us. Sophie, sweetheart, your father and I have decided that we're going to separate. Like you're getting a divorce? Sophie asked, her voice small. Yes, Corinne said gently. But that doesn't change how much we both love you. That changes only the living arrangements. You'll spend time with both of us. It doesn't change you. Sophie's eyes welled with tears, and Corinne wanted to gather her up and take it all back, to go back to pretending, to protect her daughter from the chaos that separation brings. But Richard looked at Sophie, and Corinne saw something flicker across his face. Not love exactly, but recognition. The first time in months he seemed actually present with his daughter. Sophie, he said, I want you to know that this isn't your fault. Your mom and I we're not right for each other anymore, but you're right. You're perfect exactly as you are. It was a surprisingly good thing to say. Corinne felt a tiny crack open in the wall of her anger toward him. I want to talk to a family lawyer, Richard said, looking at Corinne. I want to make sure this is done fairly for Sophie's sake. I'm not going to fight you on custody or anything, but I want to be involved in her life, meaningfully. Okay, Corinne said, surprised by this version of her husband, the one who could acknowledge his failures and commit to being present. And there's something else you should know, Richard continued, and his voice had that particular quality that meant he was delivering news he'd been holding on to. The paralegal, it wasn't what you think it was. I wasn't having an affair. I was considering it, sure, I was flirting with it, but I didn't actually. He trailed off. The truth is, I was trying to feel something, anything, because being married to you was slowly killing me. And I know that's not a good enough reason, but it's the reason. Corinne sat down heavily. She'd been so prepared to hate him, to see him as the villain in this story, that his honesty felt like a betrayal. I think I've been dying too, she said quietly. Yeah, Richard said, and she could hear sadness in his voice. I know. The conversation lasted another hour. By the end of it, they'd agreed to separate as amicably as possible. Richard would move into a hotel for a few weeks while they figured out logistics. Sophie would stay in the apartment with Corinne. They'd hire a mediator instead of going to court. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was real. After Richard left to start moving his things into a suitcase, Sophie curled up against Corinne on the couch, and they sat in silence. I don't want you to be sad, Sophie said finally. I'm not sad, Corinne said, and meant it. I'm relieved there's a difference. Are you going to be with that biker guy? Sophie asked, and Corinne's heart stopped. How did you? Dad's been talking to his mother, Sophie said. Grandma called yesterday and was yelling at him about scandal and family reputation, and I heard her mention a biker. Is that why Dad is sad? No, sweetheart, Corinne said carefully. Your dad is sad because the life he was living wasn't making him happy, and sometimes when people realize that, they have to make big changes. That's not anyone's fault. Are you going to be happy? Sophie asked. It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of everything. I'm going to try, Corinne said. I'm going to try really hard to build a life that makes sense for me, and I'm going to make sure that you're part of that life in a good, healthy way. Can you trust me on that? Sophie nodded slowly, And Corinne held her daughter and felt the weight of everything she was about to lose and everything she was about to gain, balanced like a rope across an abyss. That afternoon, after Sophie had gone to school, Corinne called her lawyer and initiated divorce proceedings. She called Dr. Chen and made an appointment for the following day. She called her mother and told her that she was separating from Richard, and listened to her mother's gasp of horror and disappointment without defending herself. "This is a mistake," her mother said flatly. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Corinne said, "but it's my mistake to make." The days that followed were chaos. Richard's mother called. Her friends stopped calling. The news spread through their social circle like a virus, and Corinne could feel the social machinery working against her. She'd broken the rules, and now she was being cast out. She didn't call Marcus. She needed to do this part alone. She needed to prove to herself that she could stand on her own, that her decision to leave wasn't just the flip side of a different dependency. She needed to know that if Marcus wasn't in the picture, she would still choose to rebuild her life. But she thought about him constantly. She thought about the way he'd held her on the motorcycle, the way his scarred face looked when he was being honest, the way he'd made her feel seen. It was a Friday night, 2 weeks after the charity ride, when her phone rang. It was Marcus. "I need to see you," he said without preamble. "I can't," Corinne said, but her heart was already racing. "I'm doing my own thing. I'm trying to figure out who I am without." "Corinne, just listen," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her stop. "Chloe is in the hospital. She had an accident on her bike. She's okay. The doctors said she's going to be okay, but—" His voice broke slightly. "I need someone right now who's not my ex-wife screaming at me that this is my fault, that I never should have bought her a motorcycle, that I'm a failure. I need someone who knows what it is to be terrified and powerless. I need you." Corinne grabbed her coat. "Where?" "Mount Sinai, the emergency room." She was there in 20 minutes. Chloe had broken her collarbone and fractured 2 ribs, but the doctors were right. She was going to be okay. What hadn't been okay was how she'd gotten hurt. She'd been riding with friends, showing off, trying to do a wheelie because the other kids had dared her too. She'd lost control and gone over the handlebars, slamming into the pavement hard enough to take the wind out of her and crack bone. Marcus was in the waiting room, his scarred face streaked with tears he kept trying to wipe away, looking smaller and more vulnerable than Corinne had ever seen him. When he saw her, something in him broke open. He pulled her against his chest, and she felt him shake. "I shouldn't have taught her how to ride," he said into her hair. "I shouldn't have bought her that bike. I'm a goddamn failure." "You're a parent who's trying," Corinne said quietly. "Which means you're going to make mistakes, all of us do." They waited through the surgery, a minor procedure to stabilize her ribs. When Chloe woke up, she was groggy and in pain but lucid. She looked at her father, and something tender and furious played across her face simultaneously. "Hi, baby," Marcus said, taking her hand carefully. "How do you feel?" "Like I crashed a motorcycle," Chloe said groggily. She noticed Corinne standing behind him. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that the lady?" "This is Corinne," Marcus said. "She's a friend of mine. I asked her to come because I needed her here." Chloe studied Corinne with an intensity that was clearly inherited from her father. "Are you my dad's girlfriend?" Corinne and Marcus exchanged a look. "I don't know," Corinne said honestly, speaking to Chloe's directness with directness of her own. "I think maybe I want to be, but that's something your dad and I need to figure out. How do you feel about that?" Chloe was quiet for a moment. "Are you staying or leaving?" "What do you mean?" "My dad's ex-girlfriend came around for a while," Chloe said. "She was nice, but then she left because she said my dad was too complicated. Are you going to leave?" Corinne looked at Marcus, at the scars that marked his face like evidence of survived trauma, at his big calloused hands that had held her so gently, at the careful hope in his gray-green eyes. "I'm going to try not to," Corinne said quietly. "But that's going to require all of us being honest about hard things. Can you do that?" "Yeah," Chloe said, and then she closed her eyes and drifted back to sleep. Marcus stayed with Chloe through the night. Corinne sat in the waiting room, watching him through the glass partition of the recovery ward, watching him hold his daughter's hand, watching him whisper things she couldn't hear. Apologies probably, promises, the weight of a parent's love and fear. At 4 a.m., Marcus came back out and sat down next to Corinne. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" Corinne asked. "For calling you here, for putting you in the middle of this. for wanting you so much that I can't seem to make good decisions when you're involved. That's not necessarily a bad thing, Karen said. Wanting someone, needing someone, those are human things. Yeah, but I'm supposed to be better than that, he said, and she could hear the old pain in his voice. The voice of a man who'd been told his whole life that he was too much, too damaged, too dangerous. Why, Karen asked simply. Because I have a daughter, because I've already failed so many people, because I don't want to drag you down with me. Karen reached over and took his scarred hand. Marcus, I'm drowning. I've been drowning for years. I don't need you to save me, but I need you to believe that I can save myself. And maybe, if we're both lucky, we can do that in a way that includes each other. He didn't respond immediately. He just looked at their hands intertwined, her manicured nails and tennis bracelet next to his motorcycle grease and faded ink. My ex-wife told me this would be a mistake, he said. She said you'd eventually go back to your world and I'd be left holding the bag. Maybe she's right, Karen said. Maybe this doesn't work out, but maybe it does. And the only way to find out is to actually try, instead of deciding in advance that we're going to fail. I'm terrified, he admitted. Me too, Karen said. But I've been terrified for so long anyway. At least this is terrifying for a different reason. By morning, Chloe was doing well. The orthopedic surgeon said she could go home that afternoon, provided she had someone to care for her. Marcus had taken time off work. He had an assistant who could run the repair shop for a few days, and Karen had called her lawyer and told her to handle any urgent matters without her for the next week. They went to Marcus's apartment together to get it ready for Chloe. His place above the repair shop was small, a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and a bathroom, but it was clean and filled with photographs of Chloe at various ages. There was one of Marcus and Chloe together, taken a few years ago at what looked like a carnival. They were both laughing, unguarded in a way that made Karen's chest tight. I want to show you something, Marcus said, and he led her to the window. Below, the street was just coming to life. Delivery trucks rumbled past. A few early commuters were heading to the subway, ordinary people living ordinary lives. This is home, Marcus said quietly. This is where I rebuilt myself, not great, not fancy, but real. The question I'm asking you is, can you be happy here? Because I don't want you to try to be happy here, not really. I want you to actually be happy, and if that's not possible for you, if you can't actually make a life in this world, then we shouldn't do this. Karen looked at the small apartment, at the life Marcus had built from nothing, and she thought about the penthouse, about the carefully curated perfection, about all the beautiful things that had never made her feel anything. I can be happy here, she said, but can we maybe also compromise sometimes? Like, I'd like to go to a nice restaurant once in a while, and you have to let me do that without arguing that the food is overpriced and pretentious. He smiled, a real smile that transformed his scarred face into something that made her breath catch. I think I can handle that, he said. They picked up Chloe from the hospital at noon. She was still in pain and moving carefully, but she was alert and, surprisingly, in a better mood than her father. I'm going to miss school for like 2 weeks, she announced from the back seat as Marcus drove carefully through traffic. That's actually awesome. That's not awesome, Marcus said. That's going to seriously mess up your grades. I have a 3.8, Chloe said. I think I can afford to miss 2 weeks and still be fine. Besides, I'll do the work at home. Karen was watching this exchange with fascination. She'd never seen Marcus interact with his daughter like this, navigating the familiar territory of parent-child negotiation. Clearly exasperated, but also fond in a way that suggested they'd had versions of this conversation 1,000 times. At the apartment, they got Chloe settled on the couch with a heating pad, ice pack, and her laptop so she could work on school assignments. Marcus ordered Thai food, and they ate together, Karen, Marcus, and Chloe, in a small living room above a motorcycle repair shop. It was nothing like her life before. It was smaller, noisier, the street sounds filtered up constantly, less comfortable in every material way. It was everything she'd been searching for. But the test, Karen realized, was just beginning. Over the next few days, as she spent more time in Marcus's world, she began to understand the genuine obstacles. His ex-wife, Diana, called multiple times a day with updates about Chloe and barely concealed hostility toward Karen. When she picked up Chloe for her scheduled time, even though Chloe was still recovering and could barely move, she made a pointed comment about distractions and readiness. Corinne's mother called to remind her that she was making a catastrophic mistake and that she'd embarrassed the family. Her former friends had largely disappeared, though a few had reached out with thinly veiled contempt disguised as concern. Richard, meanwhile, was actually being decent. He'd met Marcus once, at a child support negotiation, and had been professional if cool. He'd increased his financial support of Sophie, and he'd actually been showing up for his daughter, which Corinne appreciated more than she could say. But money was a constant, creeping tension. Corinne's divorce settlement was going to be substantial. Richard had agreed to generous alimony, but it wouldn't be permanent. Eventually, she'd need to figure out how to support herself. The idea of getting a job terrified her. She had no real skills, no work experience, no idea what she could actually do in the world. One afternoon, about a month into her relationship with Marcus, she sat on his apartment steps while Chloe was at a friend's house, and Marcus was downstairs working on a motorcycle. "I don't know what to do," she said when he came upstairs to grab water. "I can't just be your girlfriend. I need to do something. I need to make a life that makes sense." Marcus sat down next to her. "You could go back to school," he suggested. "You said you never finished college." "I was 2 semesters away when I got married," Corinne said. "My mother thought it was unnecessary. My father thought Richard was an appropriate match." "So finish," Marcus said simply. "You're only 40, you've got 50 years left to live, you could be anything." "I don't even know what I want to be," Corinne said. "Besides divorced, happy, and employed." "Then figure it out," Marcus said. "But figure it out for you, not for anyone else." That conversation planted a seed. Corinne started researching programs. She'd been studying psychology before she'd quit school. It was the one subject that had genuinely interested her, the one thing she'd chosen for herself rather than having it chosen for her. She reached out to the college she'd attended, and after a surprisingly supportive conversation with a dean who specialized in returning students, she was told she could complete her degree by taking evening classes. They'd accept most of her old credits, and she could graduate by the end of the following year. She registered for classes, she got a campus email address, she bought textbooks. She felt terrified and alive in equal measure. But then, 3 months into the relationship, about 2 weeks before she was supposed to start classes, everything fell apart. It started with a conversation Corinne overheard between Marcus and his ex-wife, Diana, on the phone. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was literally just walking from the kitchen to the living room. But she couldn't help hearing Diana's raised voice coming through the speaker. "Absolutely not. I will not have Chloe spending time in that apartment while she's there." "Diana, she's been nothing but kind to Chloe," Marcus said, his voice strained. "And she's here, she lives here. You don't get to dictate who I spend time with." "I do when it affects our daughter." Diana's voice was sharp. "Chloe is finally settling down after the accident. The last thing she needs is drama with your girlfriend." "She is not drama. Her name is Corinne, and she's been nothing but—" "I don't care what she's been," Diana cut him off. "I care that I know you, Marcus. I know how you love. It's intense and all-consuming, and then something happens and you crash. And I will not let our daughter watch her father destroy himself again. I'm serious. The next time Chloe comes to my house and tells me about Corinne, I'm filing a motion to reduce your custody." Marcus had gone very still. "You can't do that." "I can and I will if you keep dragging unsuitable women through our daughter's life." The call ended. Corinne had backed away quietly, pretending she'd just come down the stairs. But she'd heard every word, and they'd settled into her chest like stones. She didn't mention it to Marcus, but she started thinking about what Diana had said, about Marcus's intensity, about the way he loved and crashed. She started noticing patterns she hadn't seen before. The way he checked her phone sometimes, asking who she was texting. The way his mood could shift suddenly if she spent too much time with friends. The way he'd already started talking about her dropping out of school, saying it was too much stress, that she didn't need to work, that he could provide for her. It were small things, individually ignorable, but collectively they formed a pattern that Corinne recognized because she'd seen it before. It was the pattern her mother had warned her about in her own harsh way. It was the pattern of love becoming possession. One evening, about a week after the phone call, Corinne sat down with Marcus while Chloe was at school. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I overheard your call with Diana. I didn't mean to, but I did, and we need to talk about it." Marcus's face went very still. "What did you hear?" Everything, Karen said quietly, and I think she has a point. What? He sat up straight, clearly shocked. What point? She was threatening to take Chloe away from me. She's also right that I'm a destabilizing force right now, Karen said. Look, I know what I look like in this situation. I'm a woman going through a divorce, coming from money, trying to slum it with a biker and pretend I'm making some kind of authentic choice. I know how it looks. Is it true? He asked flatly. Is that what this is? Karen wanted to say no. She wanted to reassure him to make this better, but she'd promised herself she'd be honest. I don't know, she said carefully. I think some of it is true. I don't think it's all true, but I think I need to do some of this alone. I need to prove to myself, and to you, that I'm not just running from my old life into a new one. I need to stand on my own for a while. Marcus looked away. So you want to break up? I want to step back, Karen said. I want to still see you but not live together. I want to focus on school and on rebuilding my relationship with Sophie and on figuring out who I actually am when I'm not defined by someone else. In other words, Marcus said quietly, you want an exit strategy. No, Karen said firmly. I want a foundation. I want to love you from a place of wholeness instead of from a place of need. And I think you need that too. Diana isn't wrong. You have a tendency to love intensely, and I think some of that has to do with how you experienced abandonment when you were in prison, when you were struggling. And I think I have a tendency to disappear into relationships because I was taught that my value comes from how much someone needs me. So we're actually a really potentially toxic combination if we don't work on that. He didn't respond for a long time. When he finally did speak, his voice was very quiet. So you're leaving? I'm not leaving, Karen said, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away. I'm creating space so that when we come back together, if we come back together, it's because we genuinely want each other, not because we're running from something. That's what Diana said, Marcus said bitterly. She said the same thing right before she took Chloe and moved to New Jersey. Then maybe this is important, Karen said. If it's the thing that destroyed your marriage, maybe it's worth actually examining this time instead of fighting it. He left the apartment. He didn't say goodbye. He just grabbed his keys and walked out. Karen waited for him to come back. He didn't. She waited for him to text. He didn't do that either. By the next morning, when he still hadn't reached out, Karen had to make a decision. She could chase him, could try to convince him that she was serious, that this wasn't about leaving him. Or she could do what she'd said she needed to do, stand alone. She packed some of her things and moved back into a small rental apartment in Washington Heights, a place she'd found on Craigslist, a studio with a kitchenette and a view of other buildings. It was the furthest thing possible from the penthouse, and she loved it immediately. She called Sophie, who was with Richard. Hi, baby, Karen said. How would you feel if I came to get you for the rest of the week? Are you okay? Sophie asked, which was the kind of perceptive question an 11-year-old shouldn't have to ask her mother. I'm figuring things out, Karen said, which was honest. But I miss you and I want to spend time with you. Is that okay? Yeah, Sophie said. Dad, can I go with Mom? Karen could hear muffled conversation in the background. Then Richard came on the phone. What happened? He asked, and she could hear concern in his voice. I had to step back from Marcus, Karen said. I realized I was doing what I always do, disappearing into someone else instead of becoming myself first. That's probably wise, Richard said quietly. For what it's worth, I think you're going to be okay, Karen. I think you're actually going to be better than okay. She picked up Sophie that afternoon, and they spent a week in the studio apartment together. Sophie helped her arrange furniture and hang pictures. They cooked together and watched movies, and had the kind of conversations Karen realized they'd never had when they were all trying to maintain the facade of a functioning family. On Friday afternoon, Sophie was lying on Karen's bed while Karen worked on the first assignment for her psychology class. Are you and Marcus done? Sophie asked. I don't know, Karen said honestly. We need space right now. We were moving too fast, and I don't think that's healthy for either of us. But you love him, Sophie said. It wasn't a question. I think so, Karen said. But I'm learning that love isn't always enough. Sometimes you have to love someone enough to let them go, or to let them move a little bit away at least. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think he loves you too. He has that look on his face when he looks at you. What look? Karen asked. Like your oxygen, Sophie said simply. Like he needs you to breathe. Corinne set down her laptop and gathered her daughter close. That's beautiful, but it's not healthy. People shouldn't need other people like that. People should choose other people. Is that what you're trying to do? Sophie asked. Choose people instead of needing them. Yeah, Corinne said. I think that's exactly what I'm trying to do. 6 weeks passed. Corinne started her classes and discovered that she actually loved being a student. Her psychology professor, Dr. Kumar, was inspiring and kind, and the material, the study of human behavior, of trauma, of healing, felt vital in a way nothing else in her life ever had. She got a part-time job working at a nonprofit that helped women transitioning out of domestic violence situations. It paid barely anything, but she didn't need much money. Her divorce settlement was going through, and Richard had been generous. More importantly, the work gave her a sense of purpose. She was helping people who were in the place she'd been, trapped in lives that looked perfect from the outside, but were suffocating them slowly from the inside. She didn't see Marcus. She saw his Instagram posts about the repair shop. She heard through Chloe's school. They attended the same public school Sophie went to, that he was doing okay, that he'd been focusing on his work, that he seemed sadder than usual. She wanted to reach out. 1,000 times, she opened her phone to text him and closed it again. Then, on a Tuesday morning in November, about 3 months after she'd moved out, she ran into him at the grocery store. Literally ran into him, turned a corner too quickly, and collided with his chest hard enough to knock some apples out of his basket. Sorry, she said automatically, and then she looked up. Marcus looked tired. There were circles under his eyes, and his hair was longer than she remembered. He was wearing the same leather jacket he always wore, and he smelled like motor oil and home. Hey, he said quietly. Hi, Corinne said, unsure of what else to say. How are you? He asked. Good, she said, and meant it. Really good, actually. I'm in school. I got a job. She paused. I'm happy. That's good, he said, and something in his face shifted. I'm glad. I was worried that without, he stopped. I'm glad you're happy. What about you? She asked. Are you okay? Yeah, he said. Chloe's doing great. She's back to being a nightmare, which is actually perfect. Diana and I are actually getting along better now. I don't know why. Maybe because I'm not trying to build my whole life around a woman who's too good for me. Corinne flinched slightly at that. That wasn't fair, Marcus said immediately. I'm sorry. I've had a lot of time to think, and I've been in therapy with this counselor, and I've realized that you were right. About all of it. About needing space, about being too intense, about the way I was trying to consume you because I was afraid you'd leave. I never would have left, Corinne said. Not if we'd done it right. But we weren't doing it right, Marcus said. We were doing it the way I always do things, fast and hard and carelessly, and you did the brave thing, you stepped back. You created space, and I've been so angry about that, but I've also been using that space to actually work on myself, so thank you. They stood there in the middle of the grocery store, two people who'd crashed into each other at a red light and then at multiple traffic lights after that, trying to figure out if collision was destiny or just bad luck. I miss you, Corinne said quietly, but I don't want to go backwards. I don't either, Marcus said, but maybe sometime we could do coffee, not to get back together, but just to be friends, Corinne finished. I'd like that. Yeah, he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely at peace. Me too. They exchanged numbers, and Marcus went back to shopping. Corinne continued to the produce section, but she wasn't looking for apples anymore. She was looking for something else, proof that people could care about each other and still respect each other enough to let go. That love didn't always have to be consuming. That sometimes the bravest thing you could do was to walk away, not because you didn't love someone, but because you loved yourself enough not to disappear. Corinne was sitting in a coffee shop in the village with Sophie and Chloe when Marcus walked in. The two girls had become unlikely friends over the past year. They were in the same grade at the same school, and somehow the universe had decided they should share a lunch table, which meant that Corinne and Marcus ended up seeing each other with moderate frequency at school pickup and occasionally at events that Sophie or Chloe was involved in. They had coffee occasionally. They were friendly. It was healing and real and uncomplicated in a way that Corinne had never experienced with another person. Hey, Marcus said, sliding into the booth next to his daughter. I didn't know you guys were going to be here. Dad, you literally texted me that you were going to be here, Chloe said, rolling her eyes. Yeah, but I didn't know Karen and Sophie were going to be here, Marcus said, but he was smiling. We came to celebrate, Sophie announced. My mom finished her first semester of college and got a 4. That's amazing, Marcus said, looking at Karen with genuine pride. Of course you did. It's one semester, Karen said, embarrassed. It doesn't mean anything yet. It means you did what you set out to do, Marcus said. And you did it well. That always means something. After coffee, Marcus walked Karen and Sophie to their car. I'm proud of you, he said, and there was nothing desperate in his voice, no need, just admiration between two people who'd learned how to care about each other differently than they had at first. I'm proud of you too, Karen said. Chloe told Sophie that you're expanding the repair shop, hearing more people. Yeah, Marcus said. Figured it was time to think bigger, maybe give some other people a chance like I got. Karen reached out and squeezed his hand. It was a gesture of affection and goodbye and hello all at once. Thank you, she said. For what? He asked. For seeing me at that red light, she said. For telling me the truth even though it hurt, for showing me that I was capable of more than I thought I was. Marcus smiled, and his scarred face transformed into something beautiful. Thank you for being brave enough to listen, he said. Sophie was already in the car, watching them through the window with the knowing look of a child who understands more than adults give her credit for. Karen got in the driver's seat and started the engine. As she drove away, she watched Marcus recede in her rearview mirror, standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, a man who'd been given a second chance and had the wisdom to build something real with it. Sophie reached over and squeezed her mother's hand. You're happy now, right? Sophie asked. Like actually happy. Karen thought about the last year. She thought about the apartment in Washington Heights and the job she loved and the classes she was taking and the person she was becoming. She thought about mistakes and recovery and the strange grace of collision. Yeah, she said, I really am. She drove her daughter home through the city streets, no longer running from anything, no longer trying to be anyone but exactly who she was in that moment. A woman who'd picked a fight with a biker at a red light and had been forced to examine every assumption she'd ever made about herself.